You've watched it happen. A leader makes a catastrophic decision, one that damages everyone who follows them, and yet the group doesn't abandon ship. They don't revolt. They don't even question. Instead, they rally harder, defend louder, and sometimes even sacrifice more. This isn't loyalty. This is something far more disturbing, and it's wired into the architecture of how humans organize themselves. The protection of failing leaders isn't a bug in our social systems. It's a feature. Let's start with what you already know but refuse to admit. You've been part of this. Maybe not as the leader, maybe not even consciously, but you felt the pull to defend someone in power even when the evidence of their failure was staring you in the face. You've seen the signs, rationalized them away, and told yourself that things would get better. You've watched others do the same. And the strangest part? The worse the leader performed, the harder some people defended them. And this isn't stupidity. This is psychology in its rawest form. In 1978, over 900 people died in Jonestown, Guyana. They didn't die fighting against Jim Jones. They died protecting the system he built, even as it collapsed around them. Mothers fed poison to their children. Families held each other as they waited for death. And in those final moments, many of them still believed they were doing the right thing. This wasn't mass hysteria. This was the logical endpoint of a psychological mechanism that exists in every boardroom, every political party, every friend group, and every family structure you've ever been part of. The mechanism is called system justification theory, and it explains why people defend systems that harm them. When you invest time, energy, and identity into a group, your brain begins to equate the group's survival with your own. The leader becomes a symbol of that investment. If the leader fails, it means your investment was wasted. Your brain will do almost anything to avoid that conclusion, including denying reality itself. This is why conspiracy theories flourish around failing leaders. It's easier to believe in hidden enemies than to admit you've been following the wrong person. But there's a deeper layer. You don't just defend the leader to protect your past investment. You defend them to protect your future sense of self. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, but that term is too clean for what actually happens. When a leader you've supported fails publicly, you experience a fracture in your identity. You've told people you support this person, you've argued on their behalf, you've made decisions based on their guidance. To admit they were wrong is to admit you were wrong, and human brains are not designed to handle that level of self-contradiction without extreme discomfort. So what does your brain do? It rewrites the narrative. The leader didn't fail. The circumstances were impossible. The critics don't understand the full picture. The metrics being used are unfair. You've heard these phrases before because you've said them yourself, or you've heard them from people desperately trying to maintain their sense of self. This rewriting isn't conscious. It happens in the background, adjusting your perception in real time to protect you from the psychological pain of being wrong. Here's where it gets darker. The more public your support, the more extreme your defense becomes. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who made public commitments to a course of action would continue that action even when presented with clear evidence it was harmful. The researchers called this escalation of commitment, but you know it by a simpler name: doubling down. You've seen politicians do it. You've seen business leaders do it. You've seen your own family members do it during arguments at dinner tables. The pattern is always the same. Increased evidence of failure leads to increased defense of the failing party, and groups amplify this effect exponentially. When you're alone with evidence of a leader's failure, you might change your mind. But when you're surrounded by others who share your investment, the group creates what social psychologists call a shared reality. And everyone in the group validates everyone else's denial. Dissent becomes betrayal. Questions become attacks. And slowly, without anyone making a conscious decision, the group transforms from a collection of individuals into a defensive organism with one primary goal: protect the leader at all costs. You can see this in corporate environments where a CEO runs a company into the ground while the executive team praises their vision. You can see it in political movements where policy failures are rebranded as necessary sacrifices. You can see it in families where an abusive parent is defended by siblings who've normalized the abuse. The scale changes, but the psychology remains identical. The group has fused its identity with the leader's success, and admitting failure would mean admitting that the group itself was built on false premises. There's a specific moment when this protection becomes irreversible, and you need to understand when it happens. It's not when the leader first fails, it's when the group first defends that failure publicly. Once the defense is made public, the group has committed itself to a narrative. At that point, every subsequent failure doesn't weaken the narrative, it strengthens the resolve to maintain it. This is the psychology behind why scandals often make certain leaders more popular with their core supporters, not less. Each defense is another brick in a wall that separates the group from external reality. The business world gives us the clearest examples because the metrics are harder to hide. In 2001, Enron executives continued to receive loyalty from thousands of employees even as the company's fraud became undeniable. Employees defended their leaders to friends and family right up until the moment they lost their retirement savings. This wasn't because they were stupid. It was because their brains were doing exactly what human brains evolved to do: protect the tribe, even when the tribal chief is leading everyone off a cliff. But evolution didn't prepare us for modern hierarchies. In ancestral environments, group sizes were small, and bad leaders could be deposed or abandoned relatively easily. Your survival wasn't tied to abstract systems you couldn't leave. Today, you can't just walk away from your political party, your company, your ideological movement. These structures are interwoven with your identity, your income, your social network, and your sense of meaning. Leaving means starting over, and starting over means admitting that everything you've invested was a mistake, so you stay. And because you stay, you defend. And because you defend, others feel justified in defending too. This creates what sociologists call pluralistic ignorance, where everyone privately has doubts. But everyone publicly shows support because they believe they're the only one with doubts. The leader might be failing by every objective measure, but the group maintains a performance of confidence that becomes indistinguishable from actual confidence. Here's something you've probably never considered. The people who defend failing leaders most aggressively aren't the true believers at the top. They're the people in the middle, the ones who have just enough status to lose but not enough power to change direction. The top lieutenants might quietly prepare exit strategies. The bottom ranks might simply disengage, but the middle managers, the devoted volunteers, the passionate advocates, these are the people who will fight the hardest to maintain the illusion because they've invested everything and have nothing to show for it yet. Research on sunk cost fallacy shows that people don't just consider future benefits when making decisions. They consider past investments, even when those investments are unrecoverable. You've done this with relationships, staying years longer than you should have because you'd already invested so much time. You've done this with career paths, continuing in directions that made you miserable because changing course would mean admitting the degree you earned or the promotion you fought for was a mistake. And you've done this with leaders, defending them long past the point where their incompetence became undeniable. But there's another force at play, one that's even less comfortable to acknowledge. Defending a failing leader gives you power. When the leader is under attack, defenders become valuable. You gain status within the group by being loyal when loyalty is tested. This is why authoritarian movements often create external enemies and internal purges. It's not just about eliminating opposition. It's about creating opportunities for followers to prove their loyalty, which strengthens their bond to the leader and the system. You've seen this in online communities where members compete to show who's the most dedicated to the cause. You've seen it in workplaces where employees try to outdo each other in praising the CEO during crisis moments. This isn't just blind followership, it's strategic positioning within a hierarchy. By defending the leader, you're not just protecting them, you're elevating yourself relative to those who remain silent or express doubt. And here's the mechanism that makes this truly insidious. When you defend a failing leader publicly, you don't just convince others, you convince yourself. Social psychologists have demonstrated this repeatedly. The act of arguing a position makes you believe that position more strongly, even if you started with doubts. This is called the saying is believing effect. Every time you defend the leader to a skeptic, you become more convinced of your own arguments. Your brain interprets your defensive behavior as evidence that the leader must be worth defending. This creates a feedback loop that's almost impossible to break from the inside. Defend, believe more strongly, defend more vigorously, believe even more strongly. The leader's actual performance becomes increasingly irrelevant. What matters is the performance of loyalty within the group. And the more the outside world criticizes the leader, the more the group interprets that criticism as validation that they're fighting for something important against hostile forces. Historical examples of this pattern are everywhere once you know to look for them. The final years of the Soviet Union saw party officials defending economic policies that were clearly failing, not because they believed in them, but because their entire identity was built on the system. Nixon's inner circle defended him through Watergate, with some maintaining his innocence decades later, despite overwhelming evidence. Corporate boards have protected CEOs through scandal after scandal, firing whistleblowers instead of investigating claims. What's fascinating is that this protection often intensifies right before collapse. There's a psychological phenomenon called the burst of activity before extinction, where dying systems show increased defensive behavior in their final stages. Companies issue the most optimistic projections right before bankruptcy. Political movements become most extreme right before fracturing. Leaders receive the most fervent support from core followers right before those followers finally abandon them. You need to understand why this happens. As evidence of failure mounts, the psychological cost of admission becomes unbearable. The only way to manage that cost is to commit even harder to the denial. It's the same reason gamblers bet more aggressively when they're losing. It's the same reason people in failing relationships propose marriage or have children. Escalation feels like progress when the alternative is admitting defeat, and groups provide the perfect environment for this escalation. Everyone around you is defending. Everyone around you is defending. The leader becomes evidence that the leader deserves defending. This is how mass delusions form, not through individual irrationality, but through perfectly rational individuals responding to social incentives that reward collective irrationality. There's a specific type of person who becomes most valuable in these situations, and you've encountered them. They're not the most competent. They're not the most intelligent. They're the most loyal. When a leader begins to fail, competence becomes threatening because competent people can see the failure clearly. Intelligence becomes dangerous because intelligent people ask difficult questions. But loyalty, unconditional loyalty, becomes the most valuable currency in a failing system. And this is why declining organizations promote loyalists over performers. It's not incompetence, it's survival strategy. The leader surrounds themselves with people whose status depends entirely on the leader's continued power. These people have no choice but to defend the leader because they have no value outside the system. They become the leader's immune system, attacking anything that threatens the host, even when the threat is reality itself. You can identify these systems by watching how they respond to internal criticism. Healthy organizations treat criticism as information. Declining organizations treat criticism as betrayal. When someone points out a problem, the response isn't to investigate the problem, it's to investigate the person who mentioned it. What are their motives? Who are they loyal to? Are they secretly working for competitors or enemies? The content of the criticism becomes irrelevant. Only the loyalty of the critic matters. And once an organization reaches this stage, the protection of the failing leader becomes the organization's primary function. The original mission, whether it was building products, serving constituents, or advancing ideas, gets replaced by a new mission, maintaining the current power structure. Employees spend more time managing internal politics than serving customers. Political movements spend more energy defending their leaders than advancing their stated goals. The system becomes parasitic, consuming itself to protect the people at the top. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. This isn't a conspiracy. No one plans it. There's no meeting where people decide to prioritize leader protection over organizational success. It emerges naturally from individual decisions that each seem rational in isolation. You defend the leader because it protects your investment. Your colleague does the same. Together, you create an environment where defense is rewarded and criticism is punished. Others see this and adjust their behavior accordingly. Within months or years, the entire culture has shifted without anyone making a conscious decision to shift it, and the leader might not even want this protection. Many failing leaders are trapped by the very systems that defend them, and they're surrounded by people who only tell them what they want to hear. They receive distorted information that makes their failures invisible to them. They're isolated in a bubble of their own creation, maintained by followers who believe they're helping. Some leaders recognize this and try to break through it, but by that point, the system has too much invested in maintaining the illusion. You've probably wondered why smart people follow obviously failing leaders. And the answer isn't that they're not smart. It's that intelligence doesn't protect against social psychology. In fact, intelligence can make it worse. Intelligent people are better at rationalizing. They can construct more sophisticated justifications for their loyalty. They can identify more complex external factors to blame for failures. They can build more elaborate theories about why criticism is unfounded. Intelligence becomes a tool for maintaining denial, not breaking through it. When there's also a temporal component you need to understand. The longer someone has supported a failing leader, the harder it becomes to stop. This is because changing your position means invalidating not just your current self, but your past self. Every day you continue supporting the leader is another day you'll have to reckon with if you ever change your mind. This is why the longest-serving members of failing organizations often become the most defensive. They have the most past to protect. And there's a social cost that can't be ignored. When you're part of a group that defends a leader, that defense becomes part of your social identity. Your friends are other defenders. Your enemies are the critics. Your social life is organized around this conflict. To change your mind about the leader means potentially losing your entire social network. For many people, that cost is too high to pay, regardless of how obvious the leader's failures become. And the most insidious part is how this mechanism makes groups actively stupid, not individually, but collectively. You can have a room full of intelligent, well-meaning people who collectively make decisions that every individual in the room knows are wrong. Each person stays silent because they assume others support the decision. Each person defends the decision publicly to maintain group harmony. And the leader, receiving unanimous public support, continues down a path that everyone privately knows is destructive. This is called the Abilene Paradox, named after a story about a family that took a miserable trip to Abilene, Texas, because each member thought the others wanted to go. Nobody wanted the trip. Everyone went anyway. And afterward, they were all confused about how it happened. Replace that trip with a corporate strategy, a political platform, or a military campaign, and you understand how groups protect failing leaders. Nobody wants the direction they're headed, but everyone assumes everyone else does, so everyone goes along. You can break this pattern, but it requires understanding what you're up against. You're not fighting stupidity or malice. You're fighting the fundamental architecture of how human brains manage identity, social belonging, and sunk costs. You're fighting mechanisms that evolved over millions of years to help small groups survive in ancestral environments. And those mechanisms are now misfiring in modern contexts, but they're still powerful. The first step is recognizing your own susceptibility. You are not immune to this. Your intelligence doesn't protect you. Your awareness doesn't protect you. Every human brain has these vulnerabilities built in. The question isn't whether you're susceptible, it's whether you're currently in a situation where these mechanisms are being activated without your conscious awareness. Look at the leaders you defend. Not just political leaders, but anyone in your life with power over your circumstances or identity. Ask yourself uncomfortable questions. If this person failed, what would that mean about you? What have you invested in their success? What would you lose if you admitted they were wrong? How much of your social identity is tied to supporting them? And most importantly, are you defending their actual performance, or are you defending your own past decisions? Here's the truth that makes all of this darker. This mechanism doesn't just protect bad leaders, it creates them. When groups protect leaders from the consequences of failure, leaders learn they can fail without cost. The protection enables worse behavior, which requires more protection, which enables even worse behavior. It's a downward spiral where the group's defense of the leader actively makes the leader worse at leading. And the people who suffer most aren't the critics who left. Hey, they're the loyal followers who stayed until the end. They're the ones who sacrificed the most, defended the longest, and believed the hardest. When the system finally collapses, as failing systems always do, the leaders often land safely. They have resources, connections, and golden parachutes, but the followers who protected them lose everything they invested: their time, their credibility, their resources, and sometimes their entire sense of self. And this is happening right now in organizations you're part of. Leaders are failing, groups are protecting them, and the protection is making the failures worse. The only question is whether you're aware enough to see it, or whether you're so deep in the protection mechanism that you've convinced yourself everything is fine. Most people never gain that awareness until after the collapse, when they look back and wonder how they missed all the obvious signs. The signs are always obvious in retrospect. That's the cruelest part. Years later, when you're explaining to someone why you supported a failing leader for so long, the irrationality of it will be clear even to you. You'll wonder how you ignored such obvious red flags. You'll be embarrassed by the arguments you made and the criticism you dismissed, but in the moment, surrounded by others engaged in the same protection, it all seems perfectly reasonable. So here's what you do with this information. Watch for the signs in yourself. Notice when you're defending someone's character instead of their performance. Notice when you're attacking critics instead of addressing criticism. Notice when you're more concerned with maintaining group harmony than pursuing group goals. And most importantly, notice when admitting someone failed feels like admitting you failed. Because that feeling, that tight knot of discomfort when you consider that a leader you've supported might be wrong, that's not wisdom telling you to stay loyal. That's your ego protecting itself from the pain of being wrong. And the longer you listen to it, the more you invest in a failing system, and the harder the eventual reckoning becomes. Groups will always protect leaders, even when they fail. The question is whether you'll be aware enough to recognize when you're doing it, and brave enough to stop.